In 1877, police officers stormed into London bookshops and publishing houses, seizing thousands of copies of a publication called The Wild Boys of London. The order for this unprecedented raid came from the highest authority in the land, the Lord Chamberlain himself. What made these cheap paper booklets so dangerous that the Victorian establishment was willing to suppress them by force? Was it truly their content, or something far more threatening to the social order? This is a story about the Victorian penny dreadfuls, which sought to entertain the newly literate working classes and had to overcome a rather fierce moral panic from the establishment, who feared these publications would corrupt youth and threaten social order. For just 1 penny, less than the cost of a loaf of bread, Victorian readers could purchase 8 to 16 pages of the most sensational fiction ever published, featuring vampires with razor-sharp fangs, demon barbers who turned their victims into meat pies, and masked criminals who outsmarted the law. These publications became wildly popular among the working classes. You might think of them as the Victorian equivalent of a binge-worthy TV series, except they arrived weekly and cost about as much as a text message does today. But beneath the lurid tales of murder and supernatural horror lay something the Victorian establishment found far more terrifying: the democratization of literature itself. By the 1870s, penny dreadfuls were being blamed for everything from juvenile delinquency to murder. Because naturally, when faced with social problems, it's always easier to blame the latest entertainment craze than to address, crushing poverty and lack of opportunity. In this episode, we'll investigate why these cheap publications provoked such extreme reactions, reveal their true content and readership, and discover how these penny packets of poison created characters and tropes that continue to influence our culture today. You'll see how moral panics about new media are hardly a modern invention, and how the stories that society fears often reveal more about those in power than those consuming the content. But first, imagine yourself in Victorian London, where literacy was spreading like wildfire through the working classes. For the first time, ordinary people had access to stories written specifically for them. Stories that would make the establishment quake in their well-polished boots. The Society for the Diffusion of Useful Knowledge, and yes, that was their actual name, campaigned vigorously against penny dreadfuls, arguing they wasted the educational potential of the newly literate working classes. Meanwhile, police conducted raids on publishers and booksellers, particularly those selling The Wild Boys of London, which was deemed especially corrupting. The Wild Boys of London was the society's worst nightmare made flesh. While other dreadfuls were content to merely romanticize highwaymen or fictionalize gruesome murders, this series took things to a whole new level. It didn't just tell a sensational story, it presented a lurid and graphic depiction of a rebellious youth culture. Young, street-fighting thieves and criminals who dwelled in the city's underground sewer system, and featured scenes of brutal violence and sexualized cruelty, such as the flogging of bare-breasted women. The raid on the Wild Boys of London wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, penny dreadfuls became the focus of a proper, full-blown moral panic in Victorian Britain. When 13-year-old Robert Coombs murdered his mother in London in 1895, prosecutors were quick to blame the penny dreadfuls found in his possession. Newspapers ran sensational headlines, claiming these publications were penny packets of poison, corrupting the minds of impressionable youth. It was, as you might imagine, a horrific case that shocked the nation. Francis Hitchman, a prominent critic, asserted that penny dreadfuls were directly responsible for turning children into criminals.
These stories of successful crime and bloodshed have sent many a boy to prison, to the reformatory, and even to the gallows.
One imagines Mr. Hitchman wasn't exactly the life and soul of Victorian dinner parties. But was this moral outrage really about the content of these publications? Or was something else driving this panic? You'd be forgiven for thinking that Victorian society was simply concerned about protecting children from inappropriate influence. But as we'll see, there was rather more to it than that. To understand the true nature of the dreadful panic, we need to examine the social context of Victorian Britain. The 1870 Education Act had dramatically increased literacy rates among the working classes. For the first time in British history, the majority of the population could read, and publishers were quick to provide affordable material for this new market. This was a remarkable shift in British society. Imagine suddenly having millions of new readers, hungry for entertainment. Thomas Wright, a contemporary working-class commentator, argued there was no real connection between penny dreadfuls and juvenile crime. He suggested the moral panic reflected class anxieties rather than genuine concerns about brainwashing. And he had a point, didn't he? The phenomenon coincided with a period of significant social change and class tension in Victorian Britain. The establishment feared that working-class readers, consuming stories about criminals outsmarting authorities or aristocrats meeting grisly ends, might develop ideas above their station. The delicate balance of Victorian social hierarchy was, frankly, as precarious as trying to serve tea to a cat. As one anonymous publisher noted, "They fear not that our stories are too sensational, but that they are too democratic." And there we have it, the heart of the matter laid bare. Picture a society where, for centuries, the elite had controlled what stories were told, who could access them, and what messages they contained. Then suddenly, cheap printing technology and mass literacy combine to create an entirely new literary marketplace beyond their control. No wonder they were getting their knickers in a twist. So more about these publications that caused such alarm. The first penny dreadful appeared in 1836, titled Lives of the Most Notorious Highwaymen, Footpads, etc. By the 1840s, the format was firmly established. 8 to 16 pages of sensational content, often published in weekly serialized installments. The String of Pearls introduced the character of Sweeney Todd in 1846, the demon barber who murdered his customers and turned them into meat pies. Despite his cultural staying power, Sweeney Todd was not a real historical figure, but a creation of contributing authors James Malcolm Rymer and Thomas Peckett Prest. Though I imagine that was cold comfort for nervous Victorian gentlemen visiting their barbers. Varney the Vampire, published between 1845 and 1847, established many vampire tropes that would later become standard, including the first depiction of vampires with fangs. This preceded Bram Stoker's Dracula by nearly 50 years. You might say that without penny dreadfuls, our modern conception of vampires would be rather toothless. Other popular issues featured characters like Spring-Heeled Jack, a mysterious leaping terror of London, and adaptations of Gothic novels and criminal biographies. The publications were illustrated with dramatic woodcuts and engravings that brought the sensational stories to life. While the content was indeed lurid and sensational, it was no more violent than many respectable Gothic novels of the era. The key difference was who was reading them. And isn't that always the way? Material and information deemed acceptable for the educated elite becomes dangerous when in the hands of the working classes. It would seem that the sudden collapse of respectability was rather like a new teapot dropped on a tiled floor, shattered and irreparable. Or was it? Here's what's particularly fascinating. If you actually read these penny dreadfuls, as I have done, you'll find they often contain strong moral messages. Criminals are usually punished, virtue is rewarded. The stories might be sensational, but they're hardly the amoral cesspits their critics claimed. How many of those critics do you suppose actually bothered to read what they were condemning? Contrary to the establishment narrative, dreadful readers weren't simply passive victims being corrupted. Working-class boys formed clubs to share the cost, passing the prints from one eager reader to the next. These reading practices created communities and increased literacy. Some historians argue that penny dreadfuls significantly increased reading rates among working-class youths who might otherwise have had little interest in literature. Imagine that. The very publications condemned for corrupting youth were actually encouraging them to read more. Working-class readers primarily consumed the publications, but they also had a secret readership among the middle and upper classes who wouldn't publicly admit to enjoying such sensational material. Rather like how today's literary critics might secretly binge reality television when no one's looking. For many readers, the dreadfuls offered escape from the harsh realities of industrial Victorian life. The stories of criminals outsmarting authorities or supernatural beings defying natural laws provided a form of fantasy empowerment for readers who had little control over their own circumstances. As literacy increased, so did the demand for affordable reading material that spoke to working-class experiences and desires rather than middle-class moral values. You know, there's something rather touching about these working-class reading communities. Consider a group of young factory workers pooling their meager pennies to purchase the latest installment, then gathering to read it aloud for those who couldn't read themselves. In their own way, they were creating their own literary salons, just as meaningful as the highbrow gatherings in Bloomsbury drawing rooms, though I suspect with considerably more enthusiasm and far less pretension. The most shocking revelation about penny dreadfuls isn't their content, it's their legacy. Despite attempts to suppress them, penny dreadfuls fundamentally transformed popular culture. Characters like Sweeney Todd and Varney the Vampire have been continuously adapted and reimagined, from Broadway musicals and Hollywood films to prestige television. You've likely encountered these characters without ever realizing their humble origins in cheap Victorian publications. The vampire with fangs, now a standard trope in horror, first appeared in Varney the Vampire, not in Gothic literature. Think about that for a moment. Every time you see a vampire bare its fangs on screen, you're witnessing the enduring influence of this penny rag. By the 1890s, the traditional penny dreadful was being challenged by Alfred Harmsworth's half-penny publications, leading A. Milne to observe that Harmsworth killed the penny dreadful by the simple process of producing the halfpenny dreadfuller. But this wasn't the end of the form. It was an evolution. The penny dreadful format evolved into early comics, pulp fiction magazines, and eventually graphic novels. The sensational storytelling techniques pioneered in these cheap publications now dominate our blockbuster films and television series. One might say that those behind the penny dreadfuls were the original content creators, though thankfully without the sponsorship deals. Most importantly, they represented one of the first instances of truly democratic popular culture, entertainment created for and consumed by the masses, rather than dictated by elite tastes. The moral panic they inspired has been repeated countless times with new media, from comic books to video games. The establishment feared penny dreadfuls not because they were corrupting minds, but because they represented a fundamental shift in who controlled the creation and consumption of culture. And that, you see, was the real threat. The delicious irony is that these penny packets of poison that the Victorian establishment tried so desperately to suppress have become the foundation of our modern entertainment industry. The DNA of the Dreadfuls runs through everything from superhero films to Netflix series. It's rather like watching a revolution unfold in slow motion across a century and a half. A revolution that began with cheap paper and lurid woodcuts and ended with global entertainment empires. The penny dreadful phenomenon represents a crucial moment in the democratization of literature and culture. What the Victorian establishment saw as penny packets of poison were actually the first steps toward a more inclusive cultural landscape where entertainment wasn't restricted to the educated elite. The moral panic surrounding these publications reveals more about Victorian class anxieties than it does about the actual content or impact of penny dreadfuls. The fear that working-class readers might be influenced by what they read was, at its core, a fear that they might think for themselves. And isn't that always the underlying concern when new forms of media emerge? Today, surviving copies of penny dreadfuls are treasured by collectors and studied by academics as important cultural artifacts. The British Library, the Bodleian Library at Oxford, and the New York Public Library all maintain significant collections of these once disposable publications. Rather ironic, isn't it, that the very institutions of high culture now preserve what was once considered cultural pollution? The next time you encounter a vampire with fangs or watch a Sweeney Todd adaptation, remember that these cultural touchstones began their lives in cheap publications that sold for just 1 penny, publications that the authorities once tried to suppress. What forms of popular culture face similar controversies today? And what might this tell us about our own social anxieties and power structures? Perhaps we're not so different from the Victorians after all. Penny for your thoughts. Leave your observations in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe.